My phone rang at 8:40 a.m. My grandson's school called. He never made it to class today. I told them that was impossible. I personally dropped him at the front gate at 7:30 this morning. The teacher went silent on the other end. Then my personal phone buzzed from an unknown number. A cold voice sneered, "Don't bother calling the cops, old man. Bring 200,000 in cash before 6 tonight." That wasn't a stranger. I recognized that voice immediately. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. City, country, I love knowing who's out here with me on Dad's Family Stories. Quick note, this story contains fictional elements shaped for reflection and entertainment. Names and places are coincidental, but the message underneath is worth carrying. The coffee had been sitting on the counter for 11 minutes before I remembered it was there. That was how my mornings worked now, one thing at a time, in the same order, the same way every single day. I'd gotten so good at the routine that I barely had to think about it anymore. Wake up at 6, start the coffee, crack 2 eggs, call up the hallway for Leo to stop playing with his shoes and actually put them on. Remind him for the 100th time that month that his lunch was in the blue bag and not the red one, because the red one was his soccer bag and nobody wanted to open a thermos of chicken soup in the middle of a penalty kick. My name is Arthur Sterling. I'm 67 years old. I spent 22 years with the Denton County Sheriff's Department before my right knee and my cardiologist sat down together and voted me out. I live in the same pale yellow house on Maplewood Drive that my wife Diane and I bought the year our daughter Claire turned 3. Diane passed 9 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end, and for a long time after that, this house felt like a museum of someone else's life. Then Claire moved back in with Leo, and the house started making noise again. Leo was 8 years old, and the best thing that had happened to me since Diane. He had his mother's dark eyes and his grandfather's stubborn streak, and he laughed exactly the way Claire used to laugh when she was small, loud, and unself-conscious, and a little bit contagious. Every morning he came downstairs with something in his hands. A rock he'd found in the backyard, a drawing he'd made before breakfast, a question about something he'd seen on the Science Channel that I had absolutely no business trying to answer. That Tuesday morning, it was the robot. I'd built it for him 3 weekends ago. A small wooden figure jointed at the shoulders and knees, painted a deep forest green, because that was Leo's favorite color that particular month. I'd spent more time on it than I was willing to admit. Sanded every edge twice, made sure the arms moved smoothly. And somewhere inside the hollow of its chest, behind a tiny square panel that fit so snugly you couldn't see the seam, I'd pressed in something else. Small, flat. Something Leo didn't know was there, but I'll get to that. He carried the robot in his left hand all the way to school, swinging it gently the way kids do with things they aren't quite ready to put in their backpack. We walked the 4 blocks to St. Jude's together, the way we always did, me a half step behind him, a half step ahead, the way it goes when a child is just beginning to believe the world is something he can navigate on his own. At the gate, he stopped and turned around the way he always did. "Bye, Grandpa. Have a good day, bud." He grinned, that gap-toothed grin he'd been sporting since October, and pushed through the gate. I watched him walk up the front path, watched the door close behind him, and then I turned back toward home and thought about nothing in particular except whether I'd left the burner on. I hadn't. The burner was fine. The coffee was still warm. The dish soap was still foamy on my hands when the phone rang at 8:40 in the morning, and the number on the screen was St. Jude Elementary. I almost didn't answer it. There are certain times of day that carry certain meanings. A call at 8:40 in the morning from an elementary school on an ordinary Tuesday, after you've just watched your grandson walk through the front gate 30 minutes ago, that call is supposed to be automated. A reminder about picture day. A note about the spring fundraiser, the kind where the kids sell overpriced chocolate bars and everyone pretends to be excited about it. I dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle and answered on the third ring. Mr. Sterling. The voice on the other end was a woman's, careful and measured in a way that made something in my chest go very still. This is Mrs. Calloway, Leo's homeroom teacher at St. Jude's. I'm so sorry to bother you this early. You're not bothering me, I said. What's going on? There was a pause. Brief, but the kind of pause that carries weight. Well, Leo hasn't come in this morning, she said. We've done first attendance, and he's not in his seat. I wanted to call you before we escalated anything, just in case there was something we weren't aware of, a doctor's appointment maybe, or Mrs. Calloway. My voice came out flatter than I intended. I dropped Leo off at the gate myself. 7:30 this morning. I stood there until he walked inside. Another pause. Longer this time. I see, she said quietly. Mr. Sterling, would you be able to come in? I think Principal Howard is going to want to speak with you directly. I opened my mouth to say something else, to insist, to repeat myself, to explain that what she was telling me was simply not possible. And then I closed it again. Because the thing about 22 years in law enforcement is that it teaches you to recognize the exact sound of someone delivering bad news as gently as they know how. Leo was not in his classroom. I had watched him walk through that gate 30 minutes ago. Those two facts could not both be true, and yet here we were. I turned off the burner I hadn't left on in the first place. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, and somewhere between the kitchen and the car, my hands started shaking, not the big, dramatic kind of shaking that you see in movies, but the small, persistent kind that settles into your fingers when your body understands something your mind is still refusing to accept. I drove to St. Jude's in 7 minutes flat. And the whole way there I kept seeing Leo at the gate, that gap-toothed grin, that green robot swinging in his left hand, and telling myself there was a simple explanation. A mix-up, a miscommunication. The kind of thing that happens all the time in schools, the kind of thing you laugh about later. I told myself that all the way to the parking lot. I almost believed it. The parking lot at St. Jude Elementary was still half full of minivans when I pulled in. And for a moment I just sat there with the engine running, looking at the front entrance the way you look at a place that should feel familiar, but suddenly doesn't. I counted 63 steps from my car to the front door. I know because I counted them without meaning, to the way your brain latches onto small, measurable things when the large, unmeasurable ones are too frightening to face directly. Principal Howard met me in the lobby before I'd even reached the front desk. He was a trim man in his early 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a burgundy tie that looked like it had been knotted with great care that morning. He shook my hand the way people do when they're trying to project calm they don't entirely feel. Mr. Sterling, thank you for coming so quickly. He gestured toward the hallway. Let's go somewhere private. His office smelled like coffee and old paperback books. He had a framed photo of a Little League team on the wall behind his desk. 12 kids squinting into the sun, nobody blinking at the right moment. I stared at it for longer than I should have while he pulled up something on his computer. Leo's teacher took attendance at 8:15, he said. He wasn't there. We waited 10 minutes, checked the restrooms, checked the nurse's office. When we still couldn't locate him, Mrs. Calloway called you. He turned the monitor slightly toward me. We do have security cameras at the front entrance and the side gate. I've already pulled this morning's footage. He clicked play. The timestamp read 7:28 a.m. The angle was wide, the front path, the gate, the sidewalk beyond it. I watched myself walk into frame from the left, Leo beside me, that green robot swinging in his left hand. We stopped at the gate. I saw myself crouch down slightly, the way I always do when I say goodbye to him. Leo grinned. He pushed through the gate, and then the screen went black. Not a flicker, not a gradual fade. One frame it was daylight and a Tuesday morning and my grandson was walking up the front path, and the next frame was nothing. Pure black. The timestamp in the corner kept moving. 7:29, 7:30, 7:31. The camera recorded 2 full minutes of darkness before the picture came back, showing an empty front path and a gate that was swinging shut on its own. My jaw tightened. I leaned forward in the chair. Who has access to these cameras? The system is exterior mounted, Principal Howard said. Anyone standing near the gate with a can of spray paint and 30 seconds could do it. Our security consultant has been telling us for 2 years that we need covered housings on the exterior units. He stopped himself, pressing his lips together. I'm sorry. That's not helpful right now. It's fine, I said. But it wasn't fine. None of it was fine, because what I was looking at was not a crime of opportunity. This was not some impulsive, reckless decision made by a man who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. Whoever had done this had watched this school, had noted the camera positions, had known exactly which unit covered the front gate and exactly how much time they needed to blind it before Leo arrived. This had been planned, carefully, patiently, from the outside looking in. That's the idea. Torres paused. One more thing. The device Victor described, we're treating it as credible until we know otherwise. I've got an EOD team, explosive ordnance disposal, staged 2 miles back. They'll be on standby. If the situation changes, they're 8 minutes out. After Torres disconnected, the car was quiet for a while. Ray spoke first. There's something I want to run by you, about the voice note. I looked at him. Howard shook his head. The street-facing unit is on a 30-day loop. I've already asked our facilities manager to pull it. But the blackout hit that camera too, same timestamp, same duration. Whoever did this knew our layout. I stood up. I needed to move. Sitting still in that office with its Little League photo and its coffee smell felt suddenly unbearable, like wearing a coat that was 2 sizes too small. I'm going to need to see the gate, I said. We walked the front path together. Howard 1 step behind me, neither of us speaking. The morning air was cool and sharp, carrying the faint smell of cut grass from the soccer field. A kindergarten class was filing out of a side door, 20 small humans in a loose approximation of a single-file line, their teacher herding them with the practiced patience of someone who has stopped expecting perfection. One little girl in a yellow raincoat broke from the line to pick up a pebble, examined it with great seriousness, and put it in her pocket. Leo would have done exactly that. I crouched at the gate and examined the top of the camera, housing a black dome mounted on a short pole angled downward. There was a faint ring of dark residue around the lens. Matte black spray paint by the look of it. Applied fast and close, no drips. Someone who knew what they were doing. I straightened up and turned back toward the street. Looked left. Looked right. Noted the mouth of the narrow service alley that ran between the dry cleaner and the pharmacy directly across from the school entrance. Deep enough to stand in. Dark enough at 7 in the morning to disappear into. The kind of place someone would wait if they needed to be invisible while they watched a gate. My personal cell phone rang in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out without looking, already assuming it was Claire calling back. It wasn't Claire. The number on the screen was one I didn't recognize, a 214 area code, Dallas-Fort Worth, and something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up before I even answered. I pressed the phone to my ear. "You going to say hello?" said the voice on the other end. "Or just stand there in front of that school, looking like you already know how bad this is going to get?" I knew that voice. I hadn't heard it in 4 years, But some voices you don't forget. Some voices settle into your memory like a splinter, too small to remove, too sharp to ignore. Julian, I said. The line was quiet for exactly 2 seconds after I said his name. Not the quiet of someone caught off guard. The quiet of someone who had been waiting a long time to be recognized. There he is, Julian said. 22 years on the job and you still answer the phone like a cop. You know that. I turned away from Principal Howard without a word and walked 6 steps down the sidewalk, putting enough distance between us that the conversation was mine alone. My thumb found the voice memo app on my phone, a habit so old it lived in my muscle memory now, not my conscious mind. In Texas, you only need one party's consent to record a phone call. I was that party. I pressed record. Where is he, Julian? It wasn't a question. I didn't have the patience to make it sound like one. Relax, old man. His voice had a loose, unhurried quality to it, like a man calling to catch up with a friend. That looseness scared me more than anger would have. Anger is reactive. This was something else. The boy's fine. He's eating a granola bar and watching cartoons, far as I know. Cooperate, and that's how he stays. I want to hear his voice. And I want $200,000 in cash, unmarked bills by 6 o'clock tonight. A pause. Funny how we both want things. I kept my breathing even. Slow and slow, out the way they teach you in hostage negotiation, training a 2-day course I'd taken in 1987 that I'd never expected to actually use on a member of my own family. The objective was simple: keep him talking. Every word he said was information. Every second he stayed on the line was a second I could use. 200,000 is a lot of cash to put together in a single day, I said. Banks have reporting requirements. Withdrawals over $10,000 get flagged automatically by federal law. It's called a currency transaction report. You know that, Julian. You're asking me to do something that draws exactly the kind of attention you don't want. There was a beat of silence. Good. He was thinking. Then figure it out, he said. You're a smart man, Sterling. Always have been. That's actually one of my least favorite things about you. I need more time. You've got until 6. I shifted the phone to my other ear, kept my voice conversational. Where are you calling from? You sound different, like you're in a big space. He laughed, a short, flat sound with no warmth in it. Nice try. Why, I'm serious about the banking issue. If you want this to work, you need to give me until tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. I can have it by then without triggering any flags. A longer pause this time. I heard something in the background, faint, low, the kind of ambient sound that existed everywhere, and told you nothing. Then Julian spoke again, and when he did, his voice had shifted slightly. The looseness was still there, but underneath it was something tighter, something that had been coiled for a long time. You know what today is, he said. I didn't answer. 4 years ago today, I walked into a courtroom and listened to you tell a jury everything you knew about me. Everything you'd dug up. Everything you'd collected over 2 years of sniffing around my life like I was some kind of case file and not a member of your family. His voice was very controlled now. Precise. I've had 4 years to think about that. Julian, 6 o'clock, he said. And Sterling, don't call the police. I'll know if you do. I've got eyes in places you haven't thought to look yet. The call ended. I stood on the sidewalk outside St. Jude Elementary and looked at the screen of my phone for a long moment. Then I opened the call log and looked at the number he'd called from. The 214 area code. I stared at it, and a cold, specific feeling moved through me, not quite recognition, not quite surprise. Something in between. I knew that number. Not the number itself, but the device it was registered to. I'd seen it before on a list Claire had given me 3 years ago, when she was changing carriers and needed help canceling her old account. She'd lost the phone the year before that, she said. Misplaced it somewhere, never found it. Julian hadn't called from a burner. He'd called from Claire's old phone, a device that had been missing for 3 years, that he'd been holding on to, waiting. The kind of detail that didn't happen by accident. The kind of detail that told you this plan had been constructed slowly and deliberately from the inside of a prison cell over a very long stretch of time. My hands were not shaking anymore. That's the thing about fear. At a certain point, it either breaks you or it converts into something colder and more useful. Mine had converted. I walked back to where Principal Howard was standing, still waiting with that same expression of careful professional concern. I need to use your conference room, I said, and I need you to keep this campus on lockdown until you hear from me personally. He nodded without asking questions. Good man. I found a quiet corner in the conference room and dialed a number I still knew by heart. It rang twice. Kowalski, said the voice on the other end. Ray Kowalski had been my partner for 11 years at the Denton County Sheriff's Department. He was 63 years old, built like a refrigerator, and possessed of a calm so absolute that I'd once watched him finish a cup of coffee during an active shooter drill without spilling a drop. He'd retired 2 years before me and now consulted for the department 3 days a week. Ray, I said, I need you. Right now. It's Leo. 3 seconds of silence. Then, I'm in my truck. Send me the address. I heard her car before I saw it. Claire drove a 10-year-old Civic the color of old pennies, and the left front brake pad had needed replacing for 2 months. Every time she slowed down, it announced itself with a thin metallic shriek that she kept promising to fix and kept not fixing, because between 12-hour shifts and Leo's school schedule and the 1,000 other things that filled her days, a brake pad sat permanently at the bottom of the list. I was standing on the porch when she pulled into the driveway. She was still in her scrubs, dark blue, the ones with the small coffee stain near the left pocket that hadn't fully come out in the wash. She'd worked the overnight shift at Denton Regional 7 at night to 7 in the morning, and she looked it. Her hair was pulled back in a way that had started neat 12 hours ago and had since given up entirely. She got out of the car and looked at me standing on the porch, and she stopped walking. That was how she knew. Not from a phone call. Not from the words I hadn't said yet. She knew from the way I was standing, hands at my sides, shoulders set, the posture I'd carried home from the department on the bad days when Diane would take one look at me in the doorway and quietly send Claire upstairs. Dad. Her voice came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. Come inside, I said. She didn't move. Where's Leo? Claire, come inside first. Tell me where my son is. Her voice cracked on the last word, not a question anymore, not a request. Something closer to a demand that her body didn't have the strength to back up. I walked down the porch steps and took her by the arm gently, the way you guide someone who's about to lose their footing. She let me. We went inside together, and I sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where Leo ate his oatmeal every morning, where he did his homework spread across 3 different chairs, where he'd spilled an entire glass of grape juice last Thanksgiving and laughed so hard he'd fallen off his seat. I told her everything, all of it straight and clean, the way I'd always believed bad news deserved to be delivered, not softened into something unrecognizable, but not harder than it needed to be either. Julian's call, the camera, the phone that had been Claire's once, the 6 o'clock deadline. She listened without interrupting. That surprised me. I had expected tears immediately, or anger, or both at once. Instead, she sat very still, her hands flat on the table in front of her, and she listened to every word with a focused, almost rigid attention that reminded me uncomfortably of the way I'd watched that black screen in Principal Howard's office. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to call him." "No. He'll talk to me. He always, to Claire." I sat down across from her and kept my voice low and steady. "Julian made this call on your old phone. The one you told me you lost 3 years ago. He's had it this entire time. Do you understand what that means?" She blinked. Something moved across her face, a flicker of something that wasn't quite surprise. Just enough of a flicker to catch my attention. "It means he planned this," I said. "Not last week. Not last month. He started planning this while he was still inside. He's been patient, Claire. That makes him more dangerous, not less. If you call him right now off script without knowing what you're doing, you hand him information he can use." She pulled her hands off the table and pressed them together in her lap. Her knuckles went white. "Ray Kowalski is on his way," I said. "He's going to help us do this the right way." "Ray." She said the name like she was testing its weight. Then she looked up at me. "You're treating this like a case." "I'm treating this like what it is. A short, long, short, repeating. Briggs ran it against standard Morse code tables." Ray paused. "He's still working on the full sequence. The recording quality degrades toward the end, and the pattern isn't consistent throughout. But the first 3 units he was able to identify with confidence." He glanced at me. "SOS." The duffel bag was very still on my lap. I got up and put my hand on her back. I didn't say anything. There are moments when words are just furniture in an empty room, present, technically useful, but not what anyone actually needs. After a while, the sound stopped. She straightened up. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, took one long breath, and then looked at me with red-rimmed eyes that were steadier than I expected. "Tell me what to do," she said. That was Claire. Had always been Claire. She could fall apart and pull herself back together in the same 60 seconds, and when she came back ready. "Right now," I said. "You're going to drink a glass of water. Then you're going to tell me the last time Julian contacted you before today." She got up and filled a glass at the sink. Drank half of it standing there looking out the window at the backyard, at Leo's bicycle leaning against the fence, his helmet hanging from the handlebars, the way it always was, because he could never remember to bring it inside. She set the glass down, turned around. "He texted me," she said. 3 weeks ago, from a number I didn't recognize. He said he was out. He said—" She stopped, pressed her lips together hard. "He said he wanted to talk, that he had things to explain." "What did you say back?" Her jaw tightened. "Nothing. I blocked the number." "And you didn't tell me." It wasn't a question. She heard it anyway. "No," she said quietly. "I didn't tell you." She looked back out at the bicycle in the yard, and I looked at the side of her face, and I understood there was more she wasn't saying. Not yet. The doorbell rang. Ray Kowalski filled the doorframe the way he always had, broad-shouldered, unhurried, a worn canvas jacket, and eyes that had seen enough to stop being shocked by most things. He looked at me, looked at Claire, looked back at me. "All right," he said. "Start from the beginning." Ray sat at my kitchen table the way he always had, elbows forward, coffee untouched, the full weight of his attention on whoever was talking. He'd been like that for as long as I'd known him. 35 years ago, when we were both young enough to think the job was mostly about being fast, Ray had already understood that the most important thing you could do in any room was listen. Claire sat across from him. I stood near the counter. Between the three of us, we laid out everything: the camera footage, the call, the phone that had once been Claire's, the 6 o'clock deadline. Ray asked 4 questions during the whole thing, and each one was surgical, not filling silence, but cutting straight to whatever the previous answer had left unexamined. When we finished, he picked up his coffee, took one slow sip, and set it back down. "He's not working alone," Ray said. It wasn't a question. "That's my read," I said. "The camera job. That's a 2-person minimum, one to blind the unit, one to be in position for the grab. You can't do both with a 30-second window." He looked at Claire. "Did Julian have anyone on the outside? Someone he stayed in contact with while he was inside?" Claire shook her head, then stopped. Her eyes dropped to the table. "He mentioned someone once, in one of the early letters before I stopped reading them. He called him V. Said V understood things other people didn't." Ray and I looked at each other across the kitchen. "First initial," Ray said. "Could be a nickname," I said. "Could be both." Ray was already pulling out his phone. "I'm going to call the department, get someone pulling Julian's visitation logs and correspondence from his time inside. That takes a court order under normal circumstances, but a federal kidnapping charge moves things faster. In cases involving a missing child under the age of 12, judges can authorize emergency disclosure within the hour." He stood up, moving toward the back door for privacy, then paused. "Arthur, the photo of the backpack. Show me." Claire pulled up the image on her phone and slid it across the table to me. I looked at it the same way I'd looked at it the first time, systematically, the way you look at a crime scene photograph, starting from the edges and working inward. The backpack was Leo's. Navy blue, slightly too large for his frame, with the name Leo written on the front flap in permanent marker, the way his teacher had requested at the start of the school year. It was lying on its side on what appeared to be a concrete floor, photographed from above at a slight angle. In the background, blurred but identifiable, was a tiled wall and the lower edge of what might have been a bench. A transit station, designed to look like a transit station. I pulled the phone closer. There on the left shoulder strap near the base was the keychain. Leo had 3 of them on that backpack, a habit he'd picked up from a classmate who collected them. A small soccer ball, a plastic hamburger, and the third one, the one I had clipped on myself 2 weeks ago, because the original clasp had broken, and Leo had been upset about it, a tiny silver robot no bigger than my thumbnail arms down at its sides. The robot was on the right strap. I had clipped it to the left. I was certain of this the way I was certain of very few things. I remembered doing it. I remembered Leo watching me, asking why robots had to have their arms down instead of up, and me telling him that robots kept their arms down when they were resting, so they'd be ready when it was time to work. He'd accepted this with the particular solemnity that 8-year-olds reserve for information that sounds important. The robot was on the wrong strap. "Ray," I said. He came back from the doorway. I set the phone on the table and pointed. "That keychain. I clipped it to the left strap. It's on the right strap in this photo." He leaned in, squinting. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Claire pressed forward to look. "What does that mean?" "It means someone moved it," I said. "Someone took this backpack off. Leo went through it and put it back on wrong. Or I stopped working through it. Or someone else packed a duplicate. A bag they put together to look like Leo's down to the keychains, but they didn't know the order." I sat back. Either way, this photo wasn't taken at a transit station. Leo walked into himself. "This is staged." Ray straightened up. His jaw was set. So the bag at the eastbound station, Shaw is a decoy. Julian wants us sending people to the transit hub, wants us pulling camera footage there talking to station workers running down leads that don't go anywhere. I looked at Ray. While the real trail goes somewhere else entirely. Claire's hand came down flat on the table. Hard. The coffee cups rattled. So where is he? Her voice had gone tight and high in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager. If the bag is fake, if the station is fake, where is my son right now? I didn't have an answer. That was the honest truth of it, and I wasn't going to dress it up as something it wasn't. We find out, I said. That's what happens next. Ray was already back on his phone, speaking in the low, efficient shorthand of someone who had made this kind of call before. He caught my eye and held up 2 fingers, 2 minutes, and pointed at the door. He stepped outside. Claire looked at me across the table. Her hands were still flat on the surface, fingers spread wide like she was trying to hold the table still. He knew about the keychains, she said quietly. He knew Leo had them. He knew what the bag looked like. She paused. He's been watching us, Dad. For a long time. I know, I said. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from an unknown number. No words. Just a photo, the front of my house, taken from across the street, time-stamped 40 minutes ago. Someone had been standing outside my home while I was at the school. Ray came back through the door before I could process what I was looking at. His face had changed just slightly the way a landscape changes when a cloud moves across the sun. Arthur, he said. The delivery truck driver who was parked near the school this morning just called the non-emergency line. Says he's got footage on his dash cam he thinks we need to see. Ray made 2 calls before we left the house. The first was to a patrol officer he trusted, a younger guy named Castillo, who owed Ray a favor from a case 2 years back, asking him to sit on my street in an unmarked car and watch the house while Claire was inside. He didn't tell Castillo everything, just enough. In law enforcement, you learn early that information is currency and you spend it carefully. The second call was to the department's emergency warrant line. The photograph on my phone, my house, my front porch, the hydrangea bush Diane had planted in 2003 still blooming against the railing, taken 40 minutes ago, by someone standing across the street. Ray forwarded it with a single text: surveillance of victim's residence. Active federal kidnapping. Need eyes on the sender's device location ASAP. He knew as well as I did that tracing the number would take time we might not have, but you pulled every thread available and let the process run. Claire didn't want us to leave. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed over her chest, still in her scrubs, and looked at me with an expression I recognized from her teenage years. The one that meant she understood the logic of what was happening and resented it anyway. I'll call you the second we know anything, I said. You'd better, she said. Then quieter. Dad, bring him home. I held her gaze for a moment. That's the only thing I'm doing today. Frank DeLuca was parked where he'd been all morning, a white refrigerated delivery truck idling in the service bay, behind a grocery supply company 3 blocks from St. Jude's. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s, wearing a green company jacket, with the left sleeve pushed up to the elbow, a paper coffee cup balanced on the side mirror. He had the look of someone who had been sitting with a piece of difficult information for several hours and was relieved to finally hand it to someone else. He shook our hands with a grip that was firmer than necessary, the handshake of a man who wanted to be taken seriously. I wasn't sure if I should call, he said. I figured I should, but I didn't know if what I saw was actually I didn't want to waste anybody's time. You're not wasting anyone's time, Ray said. Walk us through this morning. Everything you remember in order. Frank had been parked in the service bay since 6:45. waiting on a delayed delivery from a supplier. His truck faced north toward the intersection that ran along the east side of St. Jude's property. His dash cam, a dual-channel unit he'd installed himself after a fender bender 2 years ago that his company had tried to blame on him, recorded continuously front and rear with GPS coordinates embedded in the footage. He pulled up the app on his phone, scrolled to 7:28 a.m., and handed it to Ray. I leaned in from the passenger side of the cab. The footage was cleaner than I expected. The camera had a wide-angle lens that captured the full intersection and a partial view of the school's front gate. At 7:28, the gate was visible in the upper right corner of the frame. I could see myself small, grainy, unmistakably there, crouching slightly, as I said goodbye to Leo. I watched Leo push through the gate and start up the front path. Then a silver sedan rolled slowly into the left side of the frame. It wasn't moving like normal traffic. It was moving like a car that was trying not to be noticed. No sudden stops, no obvious slowing, just a slight deceleration as it reached the intersection. The kind of movement that only registers as wrong in retrospect, when you're already looking for it. The driver's face was partially obscured by the sun visor, but not entirely. Male, dark jacket, close-cropped hair. He was looking toward the school gate, not the road, and standing at the corner on the sidewalk, hands in the pockets of a gray hoodie positioned with his back to Frank's truck, was a second figure. Julian. I knew his posture before I could make out any feature. 11 years of watching that man sit at my dinner table had made his silhouette as familiar to me as my own. He was standing very still, the way you stand when you're waiting for something you've been waiting a long time for. The sedan stopped. Not at the curb, 3 feet out in the travel lane, the way you stop when you intend to move again, in seconds. The rear door opened from the inside. Julian moved toward it, reached in briefly, and then the door closed, and the sedan pulled smoothly away from the curb and turned north. It was over in 11 seconds. I counted. The driver, I said. You see his face at any point. I thought about a Saturday afternoon 3 months ago. My garage, sawdust on the floor. Leo on the step stool with a notebook open on his knees, because Leo always needed a notebook when he was learning something. He had told me once with great seriousness that his brain kept things better when his hand had already written them down. Ray took a screenshot without being asked. He knew what he was doing. The plates, I said. Got them, Frank said. That's the other thing. Front plate was missing. But the rear plate. He scrolled again. My camera caught it when the car turned. It's a little blurry, but I ran it through one of those plate reader apps just out of curiosity, and it came back as a rental. Hertz. Out of the location on Commerce Street. Ray was already dialing. He stepped out of the cab and spoke quietly and quickly into the phone, and I stayed where I was, looking at the frozen frame on Frank's screen, that partial face in the rearview mirror, that scar along the cheekbone. I had seen that face before. I couldn't place it yet, not fully, not with the certainty I needed. But somewhere in the filing cabinet of 22 years of law enforcement, a drawer was sliding open. Mr. DeLuca, I said. You did the right thing calling. He nodded, pulling his coffee cup off the mirror and taking a long sip. I got a kid about Leo's age, he said simply. 8 years old. Loves dinosaurs. Can't stop talking about them. He looked out through the windshield at the middle distance. You find him okay? Yeah, I said. We're going to find him. Ray knocked twice on the passenger door. I climbed down from the cab. Your rental was paid for with a prepaid card, he said, his voice low. Fake name on the agreement. But the Commerce Street location has interior cameras. Department is pulling the footage now on emergency authorization. He looked at me steadily. And Arthur, the name on the visitor log from Julian's last 6 months inside. It came back. He held his phone toward me. On the screen was a name. Victor Vance. I stood in the parking lot behind Frank DeLuca's truck and looked at the name on Ray's phone screen for a long time without saying anything. Victor Vance. 2 words. 11 letters. The kind of name that shouldn't mean much to anyone who hadn't spent the better part of a Tuesday afternoon in October 10 years ago, watching a man be led out of a warehouse off Route 9 in zip ties, looking back over his shoulder with an expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite surprise. Something more patient than either of those things. The expression of a man filing information away for later. I had been the one who put those zip ties on. "Talk to me," Ray said. I handed him back his phone and started walking toward the car. He fell into step beside me without being asked another thing I'd always valued about Ray, his ability to understand when information was coming and when to simply move. "Victor Vance," I said. 10 years ago, maybe 11, he was running a transport operation out of a warehouse complex on the south side of Denton. Legitimate on paper industrial freight, refrigerated goods, long-haul contracts. The actual operation was considerably less legitimate. Smuggling, tricky high-risk cargo and off-the-books transport. He had a network that ran from the border up through 4 counties, and he was good at it. Careful patient, never more visible than he needed to be. We'd been building the case for 14 months before we had enough to move. I unlocked the car and got in. Ray took the passenger seat. When we finally executed the warrant, we found 3 people in the back of a refrigerated container unit. 3 individuals locked inside. All alive. Ray was quiet for a moment. And Vance went down for it. 18 years. He served 11, got out on good behavior and overcrowding reduction. I testified at his sentencing. I looked at Ray across the center console. He looked at me in that courtroom the same way he looked at me in that warehouse parking lot. Like he was memorizing something. Ray pulled up something on his phone. He and Julian overlapped at Clement's unit for 2 years and 4 months. That's not a coincidence. Clement's is maximum security. You don't end up there by accident and you don't get transferred without paperwork. Someone requested that transfer. Julian. Almost certainly Julian. Ray set the phone face down on his knee. Arthur, this wasn't a crime of opportunity. This wasn't a desperate man who got out of prison and did something stupid because he was broke and angry. This was constructed, piece by piece from the inside over years. He paused. Which means they know your patterns, your routines, things you don't broadcast. The photograph of my house sat at the back of my mind, like a stone in a shoe. 40 minutes before I'd gotten home. Someone standing across the street from the hydrangea bush from the porch, where Diane and I used to sit on summer evenings from the window where Leo drew pictures at the kitchen table on Saturday mornings. How long had someone been watching? Ray's phone rang. He answered, listened for 40 seconds and hung up. Commerce Street Hertz footage confirms the rental. Same scar, same build as your dash cam man. They're running him through the system now against Vance's known associates. Should have confirmation within the hour. I nodded. I wasn't thinking about the car rental anymore. I was thinking about the robot. It came back to me the way important things sometimes do, not as a sudden flash, but as a slow, deliberate surfacing, like something heavy rising through still water. 3 weekends ago. My workbench in the garage, sawdust on the floor. Leo sitting on the old step stool that had been in this family since Claire was 4 years old. The smell of wood shavings and the particular quality of a Saturday afternoon that had nowhere to be. I had sanded the robot's chest panel last, fitted it carefully, tested the seam 3 times before I was satisfied. and before I closed it, I had pressed a small, flat disc into the hollow space inside an Apple AirTag the size of a quarter that I had bought 6 weeks earlier at the electronics store on Maple Avenue without entirely knowing why. Instinct, maybe. 22 years of instinct that never fully retired just because my badge had. Leo didn't know it was there. I'd told myself I would tell him eventually when he was old enough to understand what it meant and why I'd done it. A grandfather's quiet insurance policy against a world that occasionally did not behave the way it was supposed to. I pulled out my phone and opened the Find My application. The interface loaded. I held my breath without meaning to. And there it was, a small blue circle pulsing gently on the map like a heartbeat. Moving. Not stationary, moving slowly along what the map identified as a surface road, heading west-northwest out of the city. The signal was clean and strong, which meant the robot was intact, which meant Leo had it with him, which meant Ray. My voice came out lower than I intended. I need you to look at this. He leaned over, looked at the screen, looked at me. How long has that been in there? He said. 3 weeks. He let out a long breath through his nose. Not quite a laugh. Something more complicated. Arthur Sterling, you paranoid old man. Retired paranoid old man, I said. There's a difference. I was already calling up the coordinates. The blue circle had slowed moving at roughly 15 miles per hour now, which suggested surface roads rather than highway. The direction was consistent. West-northwest, away from the city center, away from the transit hub, where the decoy backpack was sitting on a concrete floor. Away from everything Julian had tried to point us toward. Ray was already on the radio pulling in the department's GPS tracking team to lock coordinates and begin parallel monitoring. Under federal kidnapping statutes, law enforcement could piggyback on a civilian tracking device signal in an active child abduction case without a separate warrant. The emergency exception covered it cleanly. I watched the blue circle move across the map and felt for the first time since 8:40 that morning something that was not fear and not anger, but a third thing entirely. Purpose. Get Torres on the line, I said. We're going to need the tactical unit. Ray was already dialing. Outside the car window, the parking lot was bright and ordinary, a Tuesday morning in Denton, Texas, the world going about its business, as if nothing had changed. A woman pushed a shopping cart across the asphalt. A pigeon investigated a fast food wrapper near the curb. My grandson was somewhere west of here moving away from us at 15 miles per hour. But now we were moving too. The blue circle stopped moving at 11:17. I was watching it from the passenger seat of Ray's car phone, flat in both palms, the way you hold something you're afraid to drop, and when the circle slowed and then stilled, I felt the change in my chest before I processed it in my head. For 40 minutes we had followed that signal west-northwest through the city, then onto surface roads that thinned out into stretches of scrubland and chain link, and now it was sitting motionless over a location that the map identified as a decommissioned industrial property off Ridgeline Road. Sergeant Elena Torres met us at the perimeter with 4 members of her tactical unit. She was a compact woman in her early 40s, dark hair pulled back under a ballistic cap, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent years operating in spaces where excess motion gets people hurt. Ray had worked with her on 2 previous operations and trusted her judgment without reservation, which was recommendation enough for me. Signal's been stationary for 6 minutes, she said, not wasting time on introductions. Property records show the site's been vacant since 2019. Former metal reclamation facility, about 4 acres. Main structure is a processing shed on the north end. No utilities, no registered activity. Exits, Ray asked. 2 vehicle access points, East Gate and a service road on the south side. We've got units on both. She looked at me. Mr. Sterling, you're observing only. That's the condition. Understood, I said. I understood it, and I intended to honor it, because Torres was right. I was not a sworn officer. I had no authority on this property, and inserting myself into a tactical operation without authorization was the kind of thing that got people hurt and evidence thrown out of court. I would stay at the perimeter. I would watch. That was what I could do. We moved in. The processing shed was a low, wide structure with corrugated metal walls gone orange with rust, surrounded by a yard of compacted gravel and scattered debris, old machinery parts, coils of wire fencing the skeletal frame of what had once been a forklift. The morning light fell across it flat and gray, the way light looks on days when the sky can't decide what it wants to be. Torres and her team went in through the east-facing entrance, while Ray and I waited at the tree line 60 yards back. I kept my eyes on my phone. The blue circle was motionless. 11 minutes stationary now. 12. 13. My radio crackled. Torres's voice level and professional structure is clear. No occupants. Repeat, no occupants. I felt the floor drop out from under me. The signal, Mon Nutter, Ray said into his radio. A pause. Then Torres again. Stand by. We waited. I counted my own heartbeats the way I had counted steps in the St. Jude parking lot that morning. Small, measurable things when the large ones were too frightening to look at directly. I got to 27 before the radio came back. Signal is coming from outside the structure, northeast corner of the yard. Ray and I moved up to the fence line. Torres was crouching in the northeast corner of the gravel yard when we reached her, and beside her, nosing at a rusted equipment housing with the cheerful indifference of an animal that had no idea what day it was a dog, medium-sized. Brown and white ribs, showing faintly beneath a dull coat, the kind of dog that had been fending for itself long enough to lose any particular wariness of strangers. Around its neck, threaded through the links of a cheap metal tag collar, was a small flat disc. An air tag. My air tag. Torres looked up at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I crouched down and held out my hand, and the dog came to me immediately, no hesitation, tail moving in a loose, hopeful arc, and I unthreaded the disc from the collar with fingers that were steadier than I had any right to expect. I turned it over in my palm, the same unit I had pressed into the hollow of the robot's chest 3 weekends ago in my garage sawdust on the floor, Leo watching from the step stool. Victor had found it. Ray had explained the mechanics to me on the drive over in the way that Ray explained technical things efficiently, without condescension. Apple AirTags are designed with anti-stalking features built in. Any iPhone in proximity to an unknown AirTag for an extended period receives an automatic alert. Victor or someone working with him had almost certainly used a handheld RF signal detector, a device available for under $200 at any electronics retailer, to sweep Leo's belongings before they reached their destination. The sweep would have taken less than a minute. The AirTag would have lit up the detector immediately. They had found it, removed it, and attached it to the first living thing available. The dog looked up at me with amber eyes and yawned enormously, showing a full set of teeth and a pink tongue. I stood up. Ray was watching me from 3 feet away. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his face had the particular set of a man who knows that what he's about to say will hurt and is saying it anyway because the alternative is worse. They knew we'd follow the signal, he said. They wanted us here. 40 minutes pulling resources in this direction while they move Leo somewhere else. I know, I said. Arthur. I know Ray. I looked down at the AirTag in my palm. $12.99. 3 weekends of work. An 8-year-old boy asking why robots kept their arms down when they rested. I closed my fingers around it. Torres had her radio up again, redirecting her units, pulling the perimeter back, recalibrating. Around us, the gravel yard was silent, except for the sound of wind moving through the rusted walls of the shed, a low, tuneless sound like breath through a broken instrument. My phone buzzed. Not a call. A message. From a number I didn't recognize, a different number than the one Julian had used that morning, which told me he was cycling through devices, staying ahead of any trace attempt. The message was a voice note, 11 seconds long. I pressed play. What came out of the speaker was not Julian's voice. It was smaller than that, higher. And it said through what sounded like the particular thick quality of a child, trying very hard not to cry, "Mom, I'm okay." And then it cut off. I listened to it 4 more times, standing in that gravel yard, and each time I got to the end of it, I had to remind myself to breathe. He was alive. My grandson was alive, and he had said he was okay. And that was something that was everything, even if it was also the most precisely calculated thing Julian could have sent to keep me from doing something that would end this badly for everyone. The dog pressed its nose against my knee and stood there. "Okay," I said to no one in particular. "Okay." I looked at Ray. "We need to go back to the beginning. Everything we know. Lay it out again." We drove back to Maplewood Drive in silence that wasn't empty. Ray kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, and didn't try to fill the space with words, which was the right call. There are moments when talking is a way of processing, and moments when it's a way of avoiding, and Ray had always been good at knowing which was which. I sat with my phone in my lap and listened to the voice note 2 more times through the car speaker, low enough that it felt private. And then I put the phone face down on my knee and watched the city move past the window. Leo had said 4 words before the recording cut off. "Mom, I'm okay. 4 words and an interruption. The interruption mattered as much as the words. Someone had ended that recording deliberately, which meant someone had been present when it was made, which meant Leo had not been left alone. That was information. Not comfort information. I had learned a long time ago to be careful about letting those 2 things blur together on the job, because comfort made you sloppy and information kept you useful. Claire was at the kitchen table when we came in, her 3rd cup of coffee gone cold in front of her. Her phone face up on the table, showing a screen that hadn't changed in an hour. She looked at my face when I walked through the door with the particular attention of someone who has been waiting and has spent the entire wait preparing themselves for bad news. "He's alive," I said. "We heard his voice." She pressed both hands over her mouth. Her eyes filled immediately, and she held them there, not letting it out. Not yet just holding it like something too large to put down all at once. I sat across from her and played the voice note through my phone speaker. She listened with her eyes closed and her hands still over her mouth, and when it cut off, she stayed very still for a moment before she lowered her hands and said quietly, "Play it again." I played it again. And then, because she didn't say anything, I played it a 3rd time. He sounds scared," she said, "but he's trying not to show it." "I know," I said. "He's doing a good job." That made her breath catch a sharp, involuntary sound, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment before she looked back at me. "What do we do with it?" "We pull everything out of it we can," I said. "Ray's already called the department's audio forensics unit. They're going to isolate the background sounds and see what's in there." Ray had set up at the far end of the table with his laptop open, running the voice note through a basic audio editing application while we waited for the forensics team to come online. The principle was simple: the human ear processes sound as a single layer. But recording equipment captures everything simultaneously: foreground, background, ambient noise, environmental acoustics. A trained ear and the right software could separate those layers and examine each one individually. 40 minutes later, a technician named Briggs joined us by video call from the department's digital forensics lab. He was a young man with a carefully maintained beard and the focused, slightly distracted manner of someone whose attention was always partially on the screen in front of them, rather than the people around them. He had the voice note open on his system in a waveform editor that displayed the audio as a visual landscape of peaks and valleys. "Okay," Briggs said without preamble. "I've isolated 3 distinct background audio elements. First one is HVAC, some kind of ventilation system, old belt-driven by the sound of it. Low-frequency hum consistent throughout. Common in structures built before the mid-90s. He clicked something. Second element is wind. Outdoor exposure through a gap or opening the acoustic signature suggests a single point of ingress rather than general exterior ambient. Could be a broken window, an uninsulated vent, a gap in exterior cladding. And the third," Ray said. Briggs pulled up a section of the waveform on his end, isolated it, and played it through his system. What came through the video call speaker was a sound I hadn't consciously registered the first 6 times I'd listened to the recording. A bell. Low and resonant, with a particular sustain, not the sharp electronic tone of a clock or a timer, but the slow, full-bodied decay of cast iron struck by a mechanical hammer. Church bells. A specific kind, with a specific tonal quality that was not generic. "That's a carillon," Briggs said. As opposed to a standard bell tower, a carillon uses a chromatic set of bells played mechanically or by keyboard, and each installation has a distinct acoustic fingerprint based on the specific bells used, their size, their age, and the architecture of the structure they're housed in. He looked up at us through the camera. I cross-referenced this recording against the acoustic database the department keeps for regional landmark structures. I got one match within a reasonable distance from the city. He turned his screen toward the camera. St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Established 1891. Carillon installed 1923, original Belgian cast bells never replaced. "The carillon at St. Paul's rings on the half-hour and the hour," Briggs said. "The timestamp on your voice note is 11:52 a.m. The nearest half-hour mark is 11:30, which means..." The recording was made within earshot of St. Paul's at or around 11:30, Ray said. "Within approximately a mile and a half, based on signal attenuation, at that recording quality," Briggs confirmed. "The bell sound would degrade significantly beyond that range." Ray was already on his laptop pulling up a satellite map centered on St. Paul's. He drew a circle with a 1.5-mile radius, and we looked at what fell inside it: streets, properties, structures. "Filter for vacant or low occupancy structures," I said. "Industrial or rural adjacent, something with old ventilation, pre-90s construction." Ray narrowed the parameters. The list came back with 11 properties. He sent it to Torres, who ran it against known criminal activity records and outstanding code violations. 4 properties remained. 4 circles on a map. Leo was inside one of them. I looked at those 4 points and felt something sharpen behind my eyes. Not relief, not yet, but the specific focus that comes when a problem that has been formless and enormous suddenly has edges you can work against. "We split the surveillance," Torres said, her voice coming through Ray's phone. "1 unit per property, plainclothes, no approach, until we have visual confirmation." "Agreed," Ray said. He looked at me. "Arthur, we're close," I nodded. I wanted to believe that. I did believe it mostly. And then Julian called. Not my phone this time. Claire's. She looked at the screen and went pale in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness, and she held it out toward me so I could see the same number Julian had used to contact her 3 weeks ago, the one she had blocked. Somehow, it wasn't blocked anymore. Don't answer it, I said. Not yet. It rang 4 times. Then it stopped. Then a text came through 3 words, no punctuation, the way someone types when they're past caring about appearances. Bring Claire. Alone. I put my hand over Claire's phone before she could reach for it. Not yet, I said. Not without knowing what he wants and why he wants you specifically. He has my son. Her voice was flat in a way that was more frightening than anger would have been. That's why. Claire. I kept my hand where it was. Think. Julian has been planning this for years. Every move he's made today has been calculated. He doesn't do anything without a reason, and the reason he wants you alone is not because he misses your company. I looked at her steadily. Is there something you haven't told me? The question landed in the kitchen, the way a glass lands when it falls, that single, suspended moment before the sound catches up to the fact. Claire looked at me. Then she looked at Ray. Then she looked back at her phone, still face up on the table with those 3 words visible on the screen, and something in her shoulders changed. A letting go of tension so old it had become structural. He contacted me again, she said. After the texts 3 weeks ago. A week after that, different number. He said he needed money. He said if I didn't send it, he was going to show up at Leo's school. She paused. He said he knew Leo's teacher's name. He said he knew what time Leo's class went to the library on Wednesdays. The room was very quiet. How much? Ray asked. His voice was neutral. The voice of a man collecting facts, not rendering judgment. $4,000, Claire said. I sent it through a wire transfer to an account he gave me. I told myself it was to make him go away. I told myself 1 payment, and he'd leave us alone. She pressed her fingertips against the edge of the table. I know how that sounds. It sounds like someone being extorted, Ray said. Which is what was happening. Claire sending money under threat is not a crime. You were the victim of a criminal act. That's how this gets characterized legally. She shook her head slightly, not disagreeing, just not ready to accept it as absolution. I should have told you, Dad. I know I should have told you. I didn't say anything for a moment. I thought about the flicker I'd seen cross her face in Task 4 when I mentioned Julian had called from her old phone. The way she hadn't quite looked surprised. The weight she'd been carrying around that kitchen table all morning that I'd assumed was fear. It was fear. It just had a more specific shape than I'd understood. The $4,000, I said carefully. Do you know what he used it for? No, she said. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. I looked at Ray. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. Under federal extortion statutes, Claire's exposure was effectively 0. She had acted under explicit threat with no knowledge of how the funds would be used and had not participated in any planning of the subsequent crime. The $4,000 had almost certainly funded part of Victor Vance's involvement, but that liability sat entirely with Julian. What mattered right now was the information the money represented. He knew Leo's schedule, I said. Teacher's name, library day. He knew things that you don't get from driving past a school once. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window looking out at the street. He had a source. Someone close enough to this family to know the details of Leo's week. Ray's phone buzzed on the table. He looked at it, and something changed in his face, a slight forward movement, like a man who has just heard a sound he was waiting for. "Forensics came back on the photograph," he said. "The one sent to your phone this morning. The metadata was stripped, but they recovered a partial GPS tag from the image file itself. Whoever took it didn't clear the data completely." He turned the phone so I could see the screen. The image was taken from the property at 417 Maplewood Drive. I looked at the address for a moment without speaking. 417 Maplewood Drive was directly across the street from my house. It had been occupied for the past 8 years by a 69-year-old retired city planner named Dale Pruitt, who kept his lawn immaculate, collected vintage road maps, and waved to Leo every single morning from his front porch, with the reliable cheerfulness of someone who had nowhere particular to be. Ray was already running the name. He had the results in under 2 minutes. Dale Pruitt. He read his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone working to keep their reaction out of their delivery. Born 1955, Odessa, Texas. Retired municipal employee. No criminal record. He paused. One sibling, a younger sister deceased, and one first cousin, paternal side. He turned the phone toward me. The cousin's name was Victor Vance. I stood at my kitchen window and looked across the street at Dale Pruitt's house. The porch where he stood every morning. The front window where his lamp came on at the same time each evening. The driveway where his car sat, which I now noticed was not there. 8 years. He had lived across the street from my family for 8 years. He had watched Leo grow from a toddler in a wagon into a boy with a gap-toothed grin and a green robot under his arm. He had waved. He had waved every single morning, and I had waved back, and the whole time he had been watching us the way you watch something you intend to eventually use. "His car's gone," I said. "He left before this morning." "Warrants already being drafted," Ray said. "APB on his vehicle. He knew we'd identify him once we pulled the metadata he was already running." He set the phone down. Arthur. Dale Pruitt was their inside man. Everything they knew about Leo's schedule, your routines, the camera positions at the school, it came from him. He's been feeding information to Victor for months, possibly longer. I turned away from the window. Claire was watching me from the table with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was 16 years old and had done something she knew was wrong and was waiting to find out how wrong I thought it was. "The $4,000 you sent," I said. "It paid for Victor, and Victor paid for Dale." I sat back down across from her. "You couldn't have known that, Claire. You need to hear me say that clearly. You could not have known." Her eyes filled. "I should have told you the second he contacted me." "Yes," I said. "You should have." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "And we can talk about that for as long as you need to after Leo is home." Her phone rang. Julian. The same number as the text. This time I nodded at her. She answered it on speaker, and his voice filled my kitchen, loose, unhurried, a man who believed he still controlled the shape of this day. "Claire," he said. "Did you get my message?" "I got it," she said. Her voice was steadier than I expected. Steadier, I thought, than he expected, too. "Good," Julian said. "Then you know what comes next." Julian let the silence run for 3 full seconds after Claire said she'd gotten his message. It was a calculated silence, the kind that's meant to remind you who's holding the advantage. "Here's how this works," he said finally. "You come to the corner of Ridgeline and Hobart. Alone. No father, no cops, no Ray Kowalski. Yes, I know about Ray. I've known about Ray since this morning. You bring the money in a bag and you come alone, and then we talk about what happens next. I was sitting close enough to Claire to hear both sides of the call. I shook my head at her small, deliberate. She kept her voice even. Julian, Leo is 8 years old. Whatever is between you and my father, Leo has nothing to do with it. Claire. His tone shifted, not softer, but more direct, like a man setting down a tool he's been holding for a long time. I'm not interested in hurting the boy. I never was. But I need what I need, and right now what I need is for you to stop stalling and start moving. I can't get $200,000 in cash by 6 o'clock, she said. That's not how banks work, and you know it. Then get what you can get and bring it. A pause. Come alone. I'll know if you don't. The call ended. Claire set the phone down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at me. He said he'd know. He said that this morning too, I said. Dale Pruitt is in the wind. Whatever surveillance Julian had on this house ended when Dale left. I leaned forward. He doesn't have eyes on us right now. He's bluffing. You don't know that. No, I admitted. I don't know it for certain. But I know Julian and I know that when a man starts telling you he'll know things, it usually means he's worried he won't. Ray was already on his phone coordinating with Torres. The corner of Ridgeline and Hobart was 4 blocks from the decommissioned facility where we'd found the dog, close enough to suggest Julian was still operating in that general area, or wanted us to think he was. Torres would position plainclothes units at a distance. No approach, no intervention. Not yet. When Ray stepped outside to make the call, the kitchen got quieter. Claire picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down without getting up to refill it. She was looking at the middle distance the way people do when they're assembling something in their mind, sorting through what to say and in what order and how much of it. There's something else, she said. I waited. 3 years ago. She pressed her lips together. The fire. I knew which fire she meant immediately. The storage shed at the back of the property, a 10 by 12 structure I'd built myself, in 1994, where I kept tools, seasonal equipment boxes of Diane's things I hadn't been ready to go through. It had burned on a January night while I was asleep, fast and complete the way dry wood burns when it's been a cold winter. The fire investigator had ruled it accidental electrical fault, most likely possibly a space heater I'd left plugged in. I had accepted that ruling. I hadn't liked it, but I had accepted it. It wasn't an electrical fault, Claire said. I looked at her, but Julian told me. She wrapped both hands around the empty cup, a gesture that had nothing to do with warmth. Not directly, not like a confession. He said it the way he used to say things he wanted me to know without wanting to be accountable for knowing. We were still married. Leo was 4. He came home one night, and he said real casual, like he was talking about the weather, he said, "Your dad's shed burned down. Accidents happen when people stick their nose into things that aren't their business." The kitchen was very quiet. At the time, she said, I told myself I'd misunderstood, that I was reading into it. Because the alternative was... She stopped, started again. The alternative was that my husband had orchestrated the destruction of my father's property as a warning. And if that was true, then I had married someone I didn't understand at all, and I had a 4-year-old son with him, and I didn't know what to do with that. So you said nothing, I said. I said nothing. Her jaw tightened. I left him 6 months later. The shed was part of why, even if I never said it out loud. And when I left, He made it very clear that if I ever told anyone what he'd said about the fire, he would find a way to make it look like I was unstable, that I was making things up to damage him in the custody proceedings. She looked up at me. He was already talking to lawyers. I was scared, Dad. I was genuinely scared of what he would do. I sat with that for a moment. The shed had contained 3 boxes of Diane's things. Her winter clothes, her recipe books, a box of photographs from before Claire was born that I had never gotten around to sorting. All of it gone on a January night, and I had spent 2 years quietly grieving those objects, the way you grieve things you can't explain to anyone privately without a name for the loss. Julian had done that deliberately, as a warning, to a man who had stood up in court and told the truth about what he'd seen. I felt something move through me that was not quite anger. Anger was too hot for it, too immediate. This was something older and colder, the feeling of a debt being finally and fully calculated. Dad. Claire's voice pulled me back. I'm sorry. I know I should have. Stop apologizing, I said. It came out more gently than I intended. You were protecting yourself and Leo. That's what you were doing. There's nothing to apologize for. She shook her head slightly, the same gesture she'd made when Ray told her she wasn't legally culpable for the wire transfer. The same inability to accept absolution. I understood it. She'd been carrying these things alone for years, and the weight of them had become so familiar that she didn't know how to put them down even when someone held out their hands. Ray came back through the door. He looked at me then, at Claire reading the room the way he always did. Units are in position on ridgeline, he said. Torres is monitoring. He paused. And Arthur, I just got a call from the department. They've pulled medical records connected to Julian's parole documentation. Health screening from his last month inside. He stopped. I looked at him. What did they find? Ray's expression did the thing it did when the news was the kind that changed the shape of a situation entirely. You need to see this, he said. Both of you. Ray's laptop was open on the kitchen table, and the document on the screen was 4 pages long. The first page was Julian's most recent medical evaluation, a standard health screening conducted 6 weeks before his release from Clement's unit, as required under Texas Department of Criminal Justice protocol for all inmates completing sentences of 5 years or more. The document was dense with clinical language, the kind of language that has been specifically engineered to carry terrible information at a remove, as if the distance between the Latin terminology and the plain meaning of it might make the news easier to absorb. It didn't. Hepatic cirrhosis, Ray said, reading from the screen. Stage 4. The evaluation notes significant deterioration over the preceding 18 months and recommends immediate specialist consultation upon release. He paused. The prison medical staff flagged him for priority follow-up. He declined all recommended referrals within 2 weeks of getting out. Claire leaned forward. What does that mean? Stage 4. It means his liver is failing, I said. I had enough medical knowledge from 30 years of working cases to understand the broad shape of it. Stage 4 cirrhosis is the final stage. The liver has sustained damage that can't be reversed. Without intervention, a transplant, the prognosis is typically months, not years. The kitchen was very still. The $200,000, Claire said slowly. He wasn't going to live on it. No, I said. He was going to run on it. Get out of the country, find somewhere that would perform a transplant without going through the legal channels, without the waiting lists, the donor registries, the medical board oversight. I sat back. He's not trying to escape justice. He's trying to escape dying. Ray closed the first document and opened the second. This one had come through separately flagged by the department's records division after a cross-reference search connecting Julian's name to historical medical incidents involving family members listed in his original arrest documentation. "Arthur?" Ray said. His voice had the particular quality it got when he was about to say something he wished he didn't have to say. "This came up in the cross-reference. It's connected to Claire's name in the hospital system. From 6 years ago." He turned the laptop toward me. Claire saw it at the same moment I did. I heard her breath change, a small, sharp intake like someone who has been waiting for a particular door to open and is suddenly terrifyingly watching the handle turn. I read the document. I am not going to describe what it said in detail, because some things deserve more privacy than a clinical report affords them. What I will say is that it described an incident 6 years ago involving my daughter, involving a fall, involving injuries, that had been documented by a physician who had written, "Mechanism of injury inconsistent with patient's account." And then, in the particular way of physicians who suspect things they cannot prove, had written nothing further. Briggs called while you were packing the bag. He went back over the recording and isolated a third element he hadn't flagged initially. He thought it was interference at first, a rhythmic artifact in the audio track. Ray kept his eyes on the road. It wasn't interference. It was a pattern. What kind of pattern? When I looked up, Claire was watching me from across the table. She had both hands flat on the surface again, the way she'd had them when she confessed about the wire transfer. But this was different. This was the posture of someone who has been found out about something they have been carrying alone for so long that the finding out is almost a relief, even if the relief feels indistinguishable from terror. "Claire," I said. "I know," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know, Dad." I got up from the table. I needed to be standing. I walked to the back door and stood there with my hand on the frame looking out at the backyard, the bicycle against the fence, Leo's helmet on the handlebars, the patch of grass near the oak tree where he liked to lie on his back and look at clouds on summer afternoons and ask me questions about things I didn't know how to answer. I stood there for a while. Ray didn't speak. Claire didn't speak. They both understood. I think that there was no language available for this particular moment, that whatever I was working through out there at the back door needed to happen without words, in the same silence where grief does most of its real work. When I turned around, my face was dry. That surprised me. I had thought I would cry, but the thing moving through me was too large for tears. Tears belonged to a scale of emotion this didn't fit into. "She told me she fell," I said, not accusing, just stating. "Yes," Claire said. "And you protected him. Even then." She closed her eyes. "I was afraid. And I was ashamed. And I thought—" Her voice broke, rebuilt itself, continued. "I thought if I said it out loud, it became something I had to deal with. And I didn't know how to deal with it, and also keep Leo safe, and also keep working, and also keep breathing. So I just—" She opened her eyes. "I just kept breathing. That was all I could manage." I crossed the kitchen and sat back down across from her. I reached out and put both my hands over hers the way I used to do when she was small, and had hurt herself not to fix anything, because this was not a thing that could be fixed in a kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, but because some gestures exist outside of utility. Because sometimes your hands are the only honest thing you have. "We are going to get Leo back," I said. "And then whatever you need, time, a lawyer, someone to talk to, we figure it out. Together. Not alone. You understand me?" She nodded. She was crying now quietly, the way adults cry when they've held it in long enough that the release is almost silent. Ray's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His eyebrows moved a fraction barely visible, but I had known Ray for 35 years, and I knew what that fraction meant. It's a number I don't recognize, he said. Not Julian's rotation. Different exchange entirely. He answered it on speaker and set it on the table between us. I need to speak to Arthur Sterling, said the voice on the other end. I got this number off Julian's phone when he wasn't looking. It came up as Kowalski. I figured that was close enough. Male, rough-edged, breathing slightly too fast the way a man breathes when he's been moving quickly, or when he's afraid, or both. My name is Victor Vance, and I think we need to talk before this goes any further. Before I reveal what Victor said on that phone call, the one piece of information that finally told us where Leo was, drop "find him" in the comments. Let me know you're still here, still pulling for this family. Quick note: portions of this story include fictional details woven in for depth and meaning. If you'd prefer to step away before we reach the end, now is the moment. I looked at Ray across the table. He looked at me. Neither of us had expected this particular call at this particular moment. And in my experience, unexpected developments in the middle of a crisis fall into two categories: the kind that make everything worse, and the kind that, if you're careful and patient and don't let hope outrun your judgment, can change the shape of what's possible. I didn't know yet which kind this was. I intended to find out. Mr. Vance, I said, keeping my voice level. I'm Arthur Sterling. You called for me, so talk. A pause. The breathing on the other end steadied slightly, a man who had been running physically or mentally and was now making himself slow down. I want you to know something before I say anything else, Victor said. I never agreed to hurt the boy. That was not part of what I signed on for. Julian told me this was a money job, pressure the family collect, walk away clean. Nobody gets hurt, especially not a child. Another pause. What it's turned into is something different. Tell me what it's turned into, I said. Julian is sick. The word came out flat like a stone dropped on concrete. Sicker than he let on when we were inside together. I knew he had liver problems. He'd told me that much. Used it to get my sympathy. Used it to sell me on the whole plan. But the man I'm looking at right now is not the man I shook hands with in Clements. He's deteriorating fast. And when people deteriorate fast, they make decisions that don't have any logic in them, except desperation. He took a breath. This morning, when the AirTag thing happened, when he realized you'd put a tracker on the kid and we'd had to deal with it, he changed the terms. Started talking about leverage I hadn't agreed to. Started talking about things I want no part of. What things? Ray said. A device, Victor said. In the structure where the boy is. Julian put it together himself over the past 2 weeks. I don't know exactly what he built or how functional it is. Julian was always more talk than execution when it came to certain things. But he believes it works, and right now that's what matters, because a man who believes he's holding a trigger behaves exactly like a man who is holding one. The kitchen was absolutely still. Claire had both hands pressed flat against the table surface, her knuckles white, her eyes on the phone speaker. I put my hand up, a small gesture, stay steady, and she held herself together with a visible effort that I will not forget for the rest of my life. Where is the structure? I said. Victor was quiet for a moment. The calculation was almost audible, a man weighing what he was giving up against what he stood to gain. Before I tell you that, he said, I want to understand what happens to me. I'm not a fool, Sterling. I know what I've participated in today. Federal kidnapping carries life. I'm 61 years old. I've already served 11 years. I'm not going back inside to die there. That's not a conversation I can have with you, I said. I'm not law enforcement anymore. I can't make you any promises about your legal situation. But your friend Kowalski can. Ray leaned forward. I can get you connected to the right people, he said carefully. I can make sure the U.S. Attorney's Office knows you cooperated and provided actionable intelligence during an active child abduction. That cooperation gets documented and presented. What they do with it is their call, not mine. He paused. But Victor, that process starts right now on this call. Not later. Not after. Now. Another silence. Longer this time. I counted 11 seconds. Blackwood, Victor said. There's a hunting cabin on the north end of the Blackwood Preserve about 47 miles north of Denton on Route 11. The property belonged to Julian's father. It's been in his family since the 70s, never sold, just sitting. The deed's still in the old man's name. His voice had changed now. The calculation was gone, replaced by something that sounded more like relief. The specific relief of a man setting down a weight he's been carrying in the wrong direction. The cabin is single-story wood-frame cinderblock foundation. One main room, one back room. The boy's in the back room. North-facing window, ground level. Julian is in the main room. Is Julian armed? I said. Handgun. He's had it since he got out. I don't know where he got it. He never told me. And the device, whatever it is, it's on the table in the main room. He hasn't moved it. Ray was already out of his chair, phone to his ear, walking to the back door. I heard him say Torres's name, and then his voice dropped too low to follow. Victor, I said. Why are you doing this? The question sat between us for a moment. I told you, he said. I didn't sign on to hurt a child. That's the reason you're giving me, I said. I'm asking for the real one. Another silence. This one felt different from the others, not calculated but searching. A man looking for an honest answer inside himself and not being entirely sure he'd find one. I have a granddaughter, he said finally. 7 years old. Lives in Fort Worth with her mother. I haven't seen her in 4 years because her mother won't allow it. And I understand why, and I'm not arguing with it. He stopped. I looked at that boy this morning when Julian brought him into the cabin. He had a wooden robot in his hand. He was trying not to cry, and he was doing a pretty good job of it, and all I could think was that somewhere there's a man like me who made that toy for him. His voice had gone rough at the edges. I'm not that man. I know I'm not that man. But I don't want to be the reason that man never sees the kid again. I sat with that for a moment. Stay where you are, I said. Don't contact Julian. Don't move. When this is over, you'll hear from the U.S. Attorney's Office and you'll cooperate fully with everything they ask. Do you understand? Yes, he said. One more thing. I leaned toward the phone. The boy. When you saw him this morning, was he hurt? No. Victor said, and the certainty in his voice was the first fully unambiguous thing he had said since the call began. He was scared, and he was hungry, and he'd been crying before we got there. But he wasn't hurt. Julian kept his distance from him. Whatever else Julian is, he's not. He stopped. He wasn't hurting the boy. I ended the call. Ray was already back in the kitchen doorway. Torres is moving, he said. Tactical unit is 45 minutes out from Blackwood. She wants us in a vehicle headed north in the next 10 minutes. I stood up and looked at Claire. She was already on her feet. I'm coming, she said. I opened my mouth. Don't, she said. He's my son. I'm coming. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I picked up my keys. We took Ray's car because it was faster, and because sitting in the passenger seat gave me something to do with my hands. I could keep the duffel bag on my lap and work on it while Ray drove, which was better than sitting in the back next to Claire and having nothing useful to do except think about all the ways the next 2 hours could go wrong. The duffel bag had been Ray's idea, practically speaking, though the underlying logic was mine. 20 years ago, I had worked a ransom case in which the department had used a bait package, a bag of cut newspaper topped with a layer of real currency to draw a kidnapper into a controlled exchange. The principle was simple and had not changed in the intervening years. You give a man what he thinks he wants, and the wanting of it makes him careless. We had stopped at Ray's house for 11 minutes on the way out of town. I had taken a stack of old newspapers from his recycling bin, cut them into rough, currency-sized rectangles on his kitchen counter, and packed them into the bottom 2/3 of a canvas duffel bag. On top of them, I laid $4,000 in real bills, the cash Ray kept in his home safe for emergencies, spread in a loose layer, so that the first thing anyone saw when they opened the zipper was genuine money. I had then placed a small digital recorder in the interior side pocket, activated by a remote trigger on my keychain, set to begin capturing audio the moment I pressed the button. Texas law one-party consent meant every word Julian said in my presence, once I triggered that recorder, was legally admissible. The recorder had a range of 40 feet and a battery life of 6 hours. I zipped the bag and put it on my lap and watched the city thin out behind us as Ray took Route 11 north. Claire sat behind me. She had not spoken since we got in the car, and I did not try to fill the silence. She was holding her phone in both hands with the screen dark, and every few minutes I heard her take a long, slow breath, the way people breathe when they are deliberately managing something that would otherwise manage them. The landscape changed around us the way it does when you drive north out of Denton. The commercial strips giving way to stretches of mesquite and cedar, the sky opening up wider the further you got from the city's light. It was just past 3:30 in the afternoon, and the sun was moving toward the western tree line, and the light it threw across the scrubland was the particular amber of a Texas late afternoon that I had always found beautiful, and that today felt like the wrong color for everything that was happening. Ray's phone connected to Torres through the car's speaker system. "Tactical unit is 12 minutes from this Blackwood perimeter," Torres said. "We're going in dark. No sirens, no emergency lights, standard plates. We'll establish a containment perimeter before you arrive. Arthur, when you reach the turnoff on Route 11, pull over and wait for my signal before you approach the cabin." "Understood," I said. The property access road is unpaved about a quarter mile from the main road to the cabin. Julian will likely hear a vehicle on that road regardless of speed. We need him focused on you, not on us. "He'll be focused on the bag," I said. "That's the idea." Torres paused. "One more thing. The device Victor described, we're treating it as credible until we know otherwise. I've got an EOD team, explosive ordnance disposal, staged 2 miles back. They'll be on standby. If the situation changes, they're 8 minutes out." After Torres disconnected, the car was quiet for a while. Ray spoke first. "There's something I want to run by you. About the voice note." I looked at him. "See, Briggs called while you were packing the bag." He went back over the recording and isolated a third element he hadn't flagged initially. He thought it was interference at first, a rhythmic artifact in the audio track. Ray kept his eyes on the road. "It wasn't interference. It was a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" "It's a short, long, short. Repeating." Briggs ran it against standard Morse code tables. Ray paused. "He's still working on the full sequence. The recording quality degrades toward the end, and the pattern isn't consistent throughout." but the first 3 units he was able to identify with confidence. He glanced at me. SOS. The duffel bag was very still on my lap. I thought about a Saturday afternoon 3 months ago. My garage, sawdust on the floor, Leo on the step stool with a notebook open on his knees, because Leo always needed a notebook when he was learning something. He had told me once with great seriousness that his brain kept things better when his hand had already written them down. I had taught him the alphabet first. We'd gone through it letter by letter over 4 Saturday afternoons, Leo repeating each code back to me, then writing it in the notebook, then putting the notebook down and doing it again from memory. He'd made mistakes. He'd gotten frustrated once badly enough that he'd put the notebook on the floor and crossed his arms and told me Morse code was stupid. I had told him that most useful things seemed stupid until the moment they weren't. He had picked the notebook back up. "He's signaling," I said. "That's what Briggs thinks." Ray's voice was careful the way it got when he was delivering good news inside a complicated situation. If Leo has access to anything he can use to make that sound consistently, a button, a coin against a surface, any small percussion, he has a whistle, I said. It's clipped to his belt loop. He's had it there for 2 weeks. I put it there after I read something about kids getting lost on school field trips and not being found because they couldn't make enough noise. I looked at my hands on top of the duffel bag. I told him it was for emergencies. I told him if he was ever somewhere he shouldn't be, and he needed help finding him, to blow it in 3s. Claire's voice came from the back seat, very quiet, very steady. He remembered. He remembered, I said. Ray's phone buzzed. A text from Briggs' full sequence coming through. Working on WINDOW and a directional indicator. We'll have confirmation in 10. I read it twice. Then I looked up at the road ahead, Route 11 running straight and narrow into the amber afternoon, the tree line of the Blackwood Preserve just visible on the horizon like a dark hem at the edge of the sky. My phone rang. Julian's current number. I answered it immediately. "Sterling," Julian said. "Where are you?" "On my way," I said. "I've got your money. I need 30 minutes. A pause. "You've got 20. "Julian." I kept my voice even. "I'm driving 47 miles on a rural road. 20 minutes isn't physically possible. You want the money, you give me 30. Another pause. Longer. 25, he said. "And you come to the front of the cabin, alone." "Alone," I confirmed. I pressed the remote trigger in my jacket pocket. The recorder in the duffel bag began to run. Ray pulled off Route 11 onto the gravel shoulder 2 miles south of the Blackwood turnoff, the way Torres had instructed, and cut the engine. The sudden quiet was complete. No traffic, no wind worth speaking of, just the ticking of the cooling engine, and the sound of the 3 of us breathing in a stopped car on a rural road in late afternoon. The tree line was visible from here. A dark, continuous mass along the northern horizon, the kind of forest that has been growing long enough to stop looking like individual trees and start looking like a single thing, old and dense and indifferent to whatever was happening at its edges. My phone buzzed. Briggs. The text read, "Full sequence confirmed. SOS. WINDOW. NORTH, repeating pattern approximately every 90 seconds. Signal consistent with small percussion instrument whistle or similar. Recording quality confirms source is interior to structure, not exterior." I read it twice. Then I read it out loud slowly so Ray could hear every word. Claire leaned forward from the back seat. I turned and handed her the phone. She read it herself, and when she looked up, her eyes were very bright, and her jaw was set in the particular way of a person who is refusing through an act of sustained will to come apart before the moment requires it. "Window," she said. "North. He's telling us which window." "He's telling us which room," I said. "North-facing window, ground level." Victor told us that was the back room. "Leo is in the back room, and he knows there's a window on the north side, and he's been signaling his location every 90 seconds. I looked at my hands on the duffel bag. "He's been doing this since 11:30 this morning. 5 hours. My 8-year-old grandson had been alone in a room for the better part of 5 hours, frightened and hungry, and separated from everyone he loved. And instead of giving up, he had done the one thing I had taught him to do on 4 Saturday afternoons in a garage that smelled like sawdust. He had remembered. I thought about the afternoon he had gotten frustrated and put the notebook on the floor. I thought about picking it back up and handing it to him without comment, the way Diane had once handed me things I had put down in frustration, quietly, without judgment, trusting me to understand the gesture. I thought about Leo taking the notebook, opening it to the page he'd been working on, and starting again from the top. He had never once in his 8 years been someone who stayed down for long. Ray was on the radio with Torres, relaying the full Morse sequence. I heard Torres's response through the static, clipped precise, already recalibrating. "North-facing window confirms backroom position," she said. "We have 2 structures within the property boundary that match Victor's description. The Morse data eliminates one. The second structure has the north window at ground level." A pause. "We're repositioning 2 units to the north perimeter. If the boy is signaling, he's aware enough to think tactically. We don't want to spook him or Julian by moving too fast. Sterling, I need you to keep Julian on the phone for a minimum of 20 minutes once you reach the exchange point. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. 20 minutes gives my team time to get into position on all 4 sides of the cabin without using the access road. We'll be on foot through the tree line. Julian won't hear us." Her voice was steady. "This is going to work. But I need those 20 minutes. Ray ended the radio connection and started the engine. "Arthur," he said. "When we get to the turnoff, Claire stays in the car. That's not negotiable, and it's not a discussion." I know," Claire said from the back seat before I could say anything. She said it without art, which told me she had already made this decision herself somewhere in the last few miles of scrubland, and had set it down with the same quiet deliberateness with which she set everything down when she'd worked through it sufficiently. We drove the last 2 miles in silence. The turnoff was marked by a rusted metal gate standing permanently open, the hinge so corroded it had fused in place years ago. A dirt access road ran through it and disappeared into the trees. Ray stopped the car 10 feet before the gate. I opened the passenger door and got out. The air was cooler out here than it had been in the city. The trees held a different temperature, the way all old growth does, as though the accumulated shade of 100 years had lowered the baseline of the place by a degree or 2. I could smell cedar and damp earth, and something faintly metallic that might have been the creek Victor had mentioned running along the north boundary of the property. Claire got out of the back seat before I could turn around. She came to me and put both arms around me the way she had when she was 6 years old and had woken from a bad dream and come down the hallway to find me in the kitchen. I held on to her for a moment. "Bring him home," she said against my shoulder. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady on purpose, and I understood the effort that cost her, and I loved her more in that moment than I had words for. "Stay in the car," I said. "Lock the doors. Ray is going to stay with you." She pulled back and looked at me. "Ray needs to be in there with you." "Ray is going to stay with you," I said again. "I know what I'm doing." Ray met my eyes over Claire's shoulder. A long look, the kind that carries 35 years of history in it. He gave me a single nod, not agreement exactly. Something more like acceptance. He understood that I needed to walk up that access road alone, and he understood why, even if he didn't like it. I picked up the duffel bag. "One more thing," Ray said quietly. He reached into his jacket pocket and held out a small black radio no bigger than a pack of cards. "Torres's frequency. Leave it open in your shirt pocket. She'll be listening." I took it and put it where he said. I stood there for a moment at the edge of the tree line, with the late afternoon light coming through the cedars in long, slanted bars, and I thought about Leo in a room with a north-facing window blowing a whistle in the dark every 90 seconds, because his grandfather had once told him that most useful things seemed stupid until the moment they weren't. Then I walked through the gate and into the trees. The access road was soft underfoot from recent rain, and my footsteps made almost no sound. Ahead, through the tree trunks, I could see the faint shape of a structure, low, dark, angular, against the dimming sky. A light in one window. The main room. My phone rang. "Julian." "I can see the road," he said. "Where are you?" "2 minutes," I said. "I'm on foot. I left the car at the gate." A pause. "You came alone?" "I came alone," I said. "Just me and your money, Julian. 2 minutes." I kept walking. Behind me, somewhere in the trees off the access road, I heard nothing at all, which was exactly what Torres's team was supposed to sound like. The cabin materialized out of the tree line the way structures do in failing light, first as a shape, then as a mass, then as something specific and real with a rusted tin roof and a covered porch, and a single yellow light burning in the front window. Julian was standing on the porch when I came through the last of the trees. He was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed, and the first thing I noticed was how different he looked from the last time I'd seen him 4 years ago in a courthouse hallway, when he had still carried himself like a man who believed the situation was temporary. That man had been thick through the shoulders, loud in his movements, constitutionally incapable of stillness. This man was thin. Not lean thin in the way that speaks of something being taken from the inside. His face had gone angular in the wrong places, his jacket hanging off him like it had been made for someone else. But his eyes were the same. Alert, watchful, cataloging. "You actually came," he said. "I told you I would," I said. I stopped 10 feet from the porch steps and set the duffel bag on the ground between us. "It's all there." He looked at the bag, made no move toward it. "Where's Claire?" "At home," I said. "She's not part of this." Something moved across his face. Not quite belief, not quite suspicion. He pushed off the door frame and came down the 2 porch steps, moving carefully with the deliberate economy of someone managing pain they've decided not to mention. He crouched over the bag, unzipped it, and looked inside. His hand moved through the top layer of bills, and I watched his shoulders relax by a fraction enough. He stood back up. "Inside," he said. "We finished this inside?" The main room of the cabin was small and close, smelling of old wood and something chemical I couldn't identify. A propane lantern on the table threw orange light across the walls, and on the table beside the lantern was a device, a small metal box with 2 wires running from it to something I couldn't fully see beneath the table's edge. Julian watched me look at it. 30 minutes, he said. Claire signs the document I've got drawn up, gives up her parental rights, transfers legal guardianship to my cousin in Amarillo, and everybody walks away. That document isn't legally enforceable, I said. A parent can't sign away parental rights under duress. Any family court in Texas would void it within 48 hours. Maybe, he said. But it buys me time to be somewhere else before anyone figures that out. I looked at him across the table. The recorder in the duffel bag was running. Every word. "Julian," I said. "How long do you have?" He stilled. "The medical file," I said. "Ray pulled your parole documentation. Stage 4. They flagged you for specialist referral, and you declined every appointment." I kept my voice level the way I would have kept it in an interrogation room 20 years ago. "How long?" For a moment I thought he was going to deny it. Then something shifted in his face, the particular shift of a man who has been performing a version of himself for so long that the effort of maintaining it has become indistinguishable from exhaustion. 4 months, he said. Maybe 6 if I'm lucky, which I generally haven't been. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me. "There's a clinic in Guatemala. Private. They don't ask about donor provenance. 200,000 covers the procedure and 6 months of post-operative care. And if it works," I said, "you disappear." "And if it works," he agreed, "nobody has to deal with me anymore, including you." I looked at him sitting across that table in the orange propane light, and I thought about the shed in my backyard, burning on a January night. I thought about a hospital record with 4 careful pages and a notation that read "mechanism of injury inconsistent with patient's account." I thought about 3 boxes of Diane's things reduced to ash while I slept 40 feet away and believed it was an accident. And I thought about Leo 12 feet behind that wall blowing a whistle every 90 seconds in the dark. "Julian," I said, "you are using the last months of your life to do this to an 8-year-old boy." He looked at the table. "I know what I'm doing." "I don't think you do," I said. "I think you came out of that prison with a plan that made sense when you were inside, and now you're here, and it doesn't make sense anymore, and you don't know how to stop." He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. The radio in my shirt pocket vibrated once Torres's signal. 20 minutes elapsed. Her team was in position. I kept my eyes on Julian's face and kept talking. "You asked me once at Claire's wedding to take care of her," I said. "You shook my hand, and you said those exact words. I've thought about that a lot over the years." I paused. "What happened to that man, Julian? Where did he go?" Julian opened his mouth to say something. From the back of the cabin came a single sharp crack, not from outside, from inside, from the back room. "Victor." The sound came again louder this time, the particular crack of a door being forced from the inside, and Julian spun toward the back hallway with an expression that told me everything I needed to know about how much he actually trusted Victor Vance. Not at all. He had never trusted him at all. He moved toward the hallway, and I moved too, putting myself between him and the table where the device sat. He stopped, looked at me, and for one suspended second, we were just 2 men in a small room making calculations. Then Victor came through the back hallway at a run, the duffel bag over his shoulder, heading for the front door. Julian lunged for him. They collided against the doorframe, Julian reaching for the bag, Victor's elbow catching him hard across the jaw. And then Victor was through the door and down the porch steps and running, and Julian was on one knee in the doorway, and I was already moving to the table, putting my body between Julian and the device, my hands spread on the table surface, not touching it, just occupying the space. "It's over," I said. "Julian, it's over." He looked at me from the doorway. His jaw was already swelling where Victor had caught him. His breathing was ragged, not from exertion, but from something deeper. The particular breathlessness of a man who has just watched the last version of his plan dissolve in front of him. From outside came the sounds of Torres's team-controlled fast professional. 2 voices calling out in sequence the specific cadence of law enforcement securing a subject. Victor had made it approximately 30 feet past the front porch. Julian's shoulders dropped. Not a surrender exactly. More like a building that has been holding itself up past the point where it had any structural reason to and has finally quietly decided to stop. He sat down on the porch step, put his hands on his knees, and stayed there. Torres came through the front door 40 seconds later with 2 members of her team, and when she saw Julian sitting on the step with his hands visible, she gave me a single nod contained professional and moved past me to secure him. I didn't watch the rest of it. I was already moving down the hallway. The back room door was closed but not locked. Victor had simply shut it behind him when he came through. I pushed it open. The room was small and dark, the only light coming from the north-facing window where the last of the afternoon was falling in a narrow bar across the floorboards. And in the far corner, sitting with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up to his chest, was Leo. He had the whistle in his right hand. He looked at me when I came through the door, and his face did something complicated, the particular sequence of a child who has been holding himself together for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop. His chin went first, then his eyes. "Grandpa," he said, just that one word. But the way he said it told me everything. I crossed the room and went down on both knees in front of him and put my arms around him, and he grabbed on with both hands and held on with everything he had. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would have been large enough for that moment, and I had learned a long time ago from Diane. Mostly that silence offered with your whole self is not absence. It is the most complete thing you can give another person. We stayed like that for a while. Then Leo pulled back slightly and looked at my face and said with the particular solemnity of an 8-year-old who has decided something important, "I used the whistle, Grandpa, every 90 seconds, like you said." "I know," I said. "I heard it." His face changed again, the complicated thing resolving into something simpler and cleaner. Pride, maybe. The specific kind that comes from finding out that something you did in the dark, alone when nobody was watching, actually mattered. Footsteps on the porch, then through the front room, then the hallway. Torres had sent one of her team back down the access road the moment Julian was secured. I found out later it had taken less than 2 minutes to bring Claire up to the cabin. I heard her before I saw her. Claire appeared in the doorway. She took one look at Leo and made a sound I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not a word, not a name, just a sound compressed and airless and released all at once like something that had been held under pressure for 9 hours and had finally found its way out. Leo turned and saw her and was on his feet before I could stand up, crossing the room in 4 steps, and she caught him, and they went down together onto the floorboards, her arms around him, his face against her shoulder. I stood up slowly, turned toward the window, gave them the room. Outside, in the last light of that October afternoon, the Blackwood forest stood still and indifferent and ancient, exactly as it had always been. 3 weeks later, I was standing at the kitchen sink with soap on my hands when I realized the coffee had gone cold again. Some things don't change. I'm not sure whether that's a comfort or a warning. Probably both, depending on the morning. Julian was arraigned 4 days after his arrest, on federal charges that included kidnapping, extortion, criminal threatening, and arson. The last charge added after the fire investigator reopened the case on the storage shed, armed this time with Claire's testimony and the message recovered from Julian's old phone records. His attorney entered a not guilty plea as attorneys do, but the recorder in the duffel bag had captured 40 minutes of usable audio, and the U.S. Attorney's Office was not especially worried about the trial. Julian was remanded without bail. He would receive medical treatment through the federal prison system. Whether that treatment would be sufficient given the stage of his illness was a question none of us had any particular power over. Victor Vance cooperated fully as promised. His plea agreement was still being negotiated when I last spoke to Ray, but the cooperation credit was substantial, and his attorney was cautiously optimistic about a sentence that would not require him to die inside a federal facility. I did not have strong feelings about Victor's outcome. I had some feelings. They were complicated, and I was leaving them alone for the time being. Dale Pruitt was apprehended 4 days after the Blackwood operation at a motel outside Shreveport, Louisiana. He had driven 7 hours and made it as far as a room with a broken ice machine and a parking lot view before the U.S. Marshals knocked on his door. He was extradited to Texas and charged as a co-conspirator. I have not thought about Dale Pruitt very much since then. I find that I don't want to. 3 nights after we brought Leo home, Claire came and sat across from me at the kitchen table after Leo was in bed. She had a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and a look on her face that I recognized as the look of someone who has carried something too long and has finally decided the carrying is finished. She told me about the baby. All of it. Not the version filtered through clinical language in a hospital record, but the real version, what she remembered, what she had felt, what she had decided to do with it afterward, and why. I listened without interrupting the way Ray had taught me to listen, the way that is less about gathering information and more about making enough room for another person to say the true thing. When she finished, I got up and made her a fresh cup of tea. That was all. That was enough. Leo went back to school on a Wednesday. He carried his backpack with the 3 keychains, the soccer ball, the plastic hamburger, the silver robot restored to the left strap where it belonged. He did not carry the wooden robot. He had put it on the shelf above his bed, which I understood to mean it had been reclassified from something you carry to something you keep. There is a difference. This morning, a Tuesday 3 weeks and 2 days after the worst Tuesday of my life, I walked him to the gate of St. Jude Elementary the way I always have. 4 blocks. Him a half step ahead. The gap-toothed grin. The backpack slightly too large for his frame. At the gate, he stopped and turned around. "Bye, Grandpa." "Have a good day, bud." He pushed through the gate and walked up the front path, and I watched him go. And I watched the new camera housing above the gate covered now properly enclosed the way it should have been years ago, and I watched the front door close behind him. And then I stayed. I don't know how long exactly. Long enough for a kindergarten class to file past the fence on their way to the playground. The teacher counting heads with the patient efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times. Long enough for the crossing guard on the corner to wave at me twice before he stopped trying. Not because I was afraid. I had not been free of fear entirely, not since that morning 3 weeks ago, and I suspected I wouldn't be for a long time. Fear of that particular kind, the kind born from understanding exactly how quickly an ordinary morning can stop being ordinary, doesn't dissolve. It recalibrates. It had recalibrated into something I could live inside. A quiet, permanent attention. The kind of watchfulness that doesn't announce itself or demand recognition. The kind that simply stays. I turned back toward home eventually the way I always do. The coffee on the counter was cold. I poured it out, made a fresh pot, and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. Looking out at the backyard, the bicycle against the fence, the helmet on the handlebars. The bare patch near the oak tree where the grass had worn down from Leo lying there on summer afternoons, looking up at the sky, asking me questions I didn't know how to answer. Some mornings the world gives you back what you almost lost, and you stand in your kitchen and feel the weight of that. Not the drama of it, not the story of it, just the plain, extraordinary fact of it. And you think about how much an ordinary Tuesday costs, and how little you understood that price before you nearly paid it in full. I poured my coffee. I waited for the sound of a bicycle coming up the front walk after school. That was enough. That was everything. I've thought a lot about what this day taught me, and I keep coming back to one truth: adults, 50 plus, like me, tend to believe that love alone is enough to protect the people we care for. It isn't. Love without vigilance is just hope wearing the wrong shoes. I spent 22 years in law enforcement and still didn't see the danger living across the street from my own front porch. Don't be like me. Don't assume that familiar means safe. Teach your grandchildren skills on quiet Saturday afternoons, because those lessons might someday bring them home. God put Leo back in my arms that October evening, and I do not take that lightly. Here's what I believe: Dad's revenge isn't about anger or settling scores. Real Dad's revenge is showing up every morning, every gate, every ordinary Tuesday, refusing to let anyone break your family. That's the truth. Adults 50 plus understand better than most. The unremarkable moments are worth fighting hardest for. Staying steady under pressure is the truest form of Dad's revenge there is. And for every adult's 50 plus person watching, you've been protecting things quietly for years. You already know the cost of ordinary mornings. If this story reached you somewhere real, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe, the next story is already waiting. To everyone who stayed until the end, thank you. It means more than you know. These stories contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and perspective. If this isn't the content you're looking for today, no hard feelings, find what's right for you.